What's up? Welcome back to Nowstalgia. Dave here with a review of Formula One Drive to Survive Season 5 on Netflix. I'm going to give my full thoughts on the series as a whole, and then go episode by episode, what I thought, what I think they left out, what I was happy they included, any insights I got. Just up front, I'm someone who is a new fan of Formula One, but I've watched every race in the last 2 years. I'm hardcore, super into it, and I now appreciate Drive to Survive. This obviously very successful docu-series that is so paramount to Formula One growing in the United States. I view this series in a different light than I once did, because now that I pay attention to the sport, full time, all the way in, I know the story. So seeing how the story is then portrayed later on the series for Netflix, I think is very interesting in terms of like how this is a crafted series, what narratives they choose to focus on, and I find that interesting. I think the criticism that some of the F1 community has had for the series has merit to it, but I also think the value of Drive to Survive is largely unchanged, and I think overall season 5 is a huge improvement over season 4, which I think was clearly the worst iteration of Drive to Survive and definitely the most open to its criticism in terms of like making fake narratives and stuff. The thing is, Formula One, why it's so awesome is that it is so rich with its own drama and narrative that does not need to be manufactured. I think largely with season 5, Box to Box Films, production company that makes this series for Netflix, they kind of got that message themselves and kind of focused on the drama that was right there in the open from the 2022 Formula One season. So I was very happy to see that, and I hope that Drive to Survive continues in the years to come, because I think it's really illuminating and fun to see those backroom shots and just catch conversations. And is some stuff contrived for fun, for B-roll, like when we see Mattia and Gunter driving a car around in Italy in the Dolomites? Yeah, obviously that's reality TV for you. But I think the docu-series value is still really paramount, and the show is really successful at telling a story. So let's just get into it, uh, episode by episode. So obviously this is spoilers for this series. I don't know why anyone would watch this and be concerned about that, but I'm just going to tell you what happens if you somehow were not wanting to know what happened in the 2022 Formula One season. But here we go. So I think episode 1 does a really good job of setting the stage for this new era of Formula One with these new regulations, the huge change. Will Buxton doing his thing, explaining things in broad terms for the layman. Ground effect cars, they're completely new, completely different from the last era, the turbo hybrid era that Mercedes dominated until, of course, Red Bull took the driver's championship at the end of it. So 2022 is like a brand new situation and brand new for everyone, and there's a lot of doubt and unknown about it. I think they did a good job of setting that up. Along those lines, they kind of established that there's a lot of Ferrari pressure and expectations, and their first time winning, or first time with like a really good chance to win in a long time. They're just kind of different in that regard, and I think it's a really good foreshadowing, honestly, of what happens to Ferrari in the 2022 season. I think that was handled well. Also, they acknowledged that Nikita Mazepin, of course, was dropped very last minute due to his status as a Russian, and Kevin Magnussen comes back into Formula One. I thought that was was a decent storyline to kind of focus on the first episode. Kevin Magnussen getting P5 on his return. Haas didn't have a whole lot to really gravitate towards. Then again, though, we got a lot of Mick later on in episode 4. So I don't know, like in the process, we don't, with Bahrain, and in the course of the series, we ignore Guan Yu Zhou, or Zhou Guan Yu. We ignore Zhou Guan Yu's arrival in the sport, getting points on debut. I think Zhou kind of gets short shrift with this season, and I'm hoping that if he has a slightly stronger season in 2023, he'll probably get more shine on the series, but there probably just wasn't enough of a narrative with Alfa Romeo to tell, even with Bottas joining the team. So that stood out to me, something that was left out, but I understand why they kind of focused on Magnussen's return here. Obviously Haas, Steiner, big stars of the series in a certain sense, so I get it. They also do a good job of setting up Dan Ricciardo's difficult season and career to follow, of course, finishing P18 at Bahrain. And also showing you the Red Bull DNFs perhaps presenting drama that ultimately didn't really bear out when, if you've watched the 2022 season, you know what happens with Red Bull ultimately dominating, Verstappen dominating. they set it up that like it's a great chance for Ferrari, and Ferrari has this huge lead, right? And as we know, that doesn't not doing anything. Right after this, episode 2, of course, gets right into another gigantic storyline from the 2022 season, which of course would be Mercedes bottling it with this new era on the back foot and ultimately coming in third place because their car is just not as good as it needs to be with this porpoising, And one thing that I wish they would have handled, when they would talk about porpoising, they show everyone struggling with the bouncing and the porpoising from the ground effect in testing at Bahrain before the season. They acknowledge that everyone else is able to fix it pretty quickly and get it under control, but Mercedes can't. They never explicitly say that it's because of the aero design choices with the chassis and that this quote zero pod design of the Mercedes was just a flawed choice in that setup. Like you have a really awesome scene of the guys on the grid before like the photo kind of examining the cars for the first time and everyone's kind of looking at the Mercedes. Russell's making comments like, don't know about that one. Vettel's making jokes. They don't explicitly say that there was a reason why they couldn't just get under control like everyone else. I wish they would have made that a little bit more clear for the average viewer. They show you the gigantic crash at Silverstone with Zhou and Russell, Hamilton's Silverstone podium. They almost present that as like the first time Hamilton was on the podium in 2022, which was not actually the case. But of course, I was happy they showed Through Goes Hamilton from Silverstone, but they didn't overhype it because ultimately Hamilton didn't win the race. That was a move that was so epic in the moment and like really got me hyped. But I'm glad they didn't like overdo it because ultimately Hamilton still came in third after that the thing, right? Episode 3, another great episode because it highlights another huge aspect of this season, which was Ferrari fucking up. God, obviously we talked about this every week as it happened, but episode 1 alluding to these high expectations, high pressure situation for Ferrari, for the drivers, for Mattia, for the leadership, and then just showing you reliability issues, but most importantly, strategic miscalls that cost Ferrari points, cost Ferrari podiums, cost Ferrari wins. The Monaco box timing, Ferrari being in first and second to start Monaco and then not winning the race with either of those guys. Absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, the reliability at Baku with Sainz was terrible. And then I was happy they showed this too. Mattia's comments, Donato, of course, the team principal at Ferrari, Mattia's comments on criticism levied at the team and almost him being in denial and another foreshadowing of like what's to come both for Ferrari and for Bonato's position, right? Keeping it going, you have Sainz winning his first race ever after his first pole at Silverstone. But of course, it's because of Sainz's infamous "stop inventing" line, right? He overrode the strategy and won the race himself, basically. But in the process, Ferrari fucked over Leclerc. And you had the Sky commentators from the footage there. Ferrari won, but they won with the wrong car, and like Ferrari's inability to put Leclerc in the best position to succeed is established really well here. I think they did a pretty good job too of like showing you like how Max was out of position in that race, getting the damage and stuff. And then at the end, you have Mattia doing the finger point at Leclerc, which was a huge thing, right? Like it was just clear that Ferrari was fucking up all year. And I think the show Drive to Survive does a good job of like hammering that home of like how that was being done. Episode 4 kind of takes us off the gas a little bit in terms of the most important stuff. This is an episode about Haas and about Mick Schumacher. The pressure of being Michael Schumacher's son. His relationship with Sebastian Vettel, at least a little bit. It's kind of most of the Vettel stuff we get all season is in this episode, and some foreshadowing about if he'll keep his seat. I thought that was fine. I feel like I don't know, like there's just some like other stuff that I just found more interesting than like will Mick keep his seat, because like Mick Schumacher was not a spectacular Formula One driver, So on the other hand, there's a lot of drama. He has the name. I get it. I get why he gets an episode, but don't necessarily feel like I needed this because we're also going to get a Yuki Tsunoda episode again after last season. Like, I don't know. Not my favorite, but I understand. Like, it's still well done for what it is. Episode 5 and 6. I'm so happy they dedicated 2 episodes to this, which would be everything going on with Alpine and McLaren in terms of the battle for 4th place, as well as the absolute shit show that happens in the driver market when Sebastian Vettel announces retirement, Alonso decides to leave Alpine and go to Aston Martin, and then Alpine is seemingly unable to promote Oscar Piastri, their reserve, and lose him to McLaren, then have to decide who are they going to pick as their second driver to replace Alonso, and they ultimately go, of course, with Pierre Gasly, having him move over from Alpha. I love how they did all this, having Zach Brown, having Otmar Schaffnauer. I think they did a really good job of highlighting that drama, highlighting how crazy that was. I was surprised to see Piastri actually talk, to Netflix, talk to Box to Box. Like, that was awesome. They had footage of Piastri, and you see Mark Webber a little bit, his manager. They did a pretty good job of setting all that up, and then later on with the Yuki episode as well, that Pierre gets replaced with Nick DeVries after his kind of shockingly successful substitution race at Williams, where he gets points on debut. That was all done really well. I think for the most part, they made that very coherent for someone who might not know it. The one thing I noted, though, about how they portray this is that obviously they have to condense it in terms of like how much time they dedicate to it. But there was like one key figure that's missing from this whole story, and that would be Colton Herta, of course, the American IndyCar driver, IndyCar winner, who Red Bull, of course, wanted to race for them at AlphaTauri, and there was kind of condition on they were not going to let Pierre go join Alpine, let him out of contract unless they could get their man. And Herta, of course, can't get the super license in the end, isn't eligible to race in F1. It doesn't work out. But then, of course, Nick DeVries stuff happens, and Red Bull has another option. They go for him. It would have been cool, perhaps, to, if maybe it's another episode, you could have talked about the Herta not actually making it into F1 due to the stuff with super license, and contrast that with the other American driver who's joining Williams next year, Logan Sargent, who does get a super license out of F2. I understand why they don't do it. They kind of focus on people we've already know in the context of the series, Alonso and especially Pierre. I understand, but it did kind of stand out to me. It's like, there was a few other elements to this that you had to, I guess, leave out, and of course they had to focus on McLaren is taking Piastri because they're replacing Daniel Ricciardo. Ricciardo has been the star of Drive to Survive basically the entire time. Think about it, season 1, 2018 season, how's him at Red Bull? So you got his end of his Red Bull days, all his Renault days, and all his McLaren days are in Drive to Survive. Like, the whole Danny Rick experience has largely been captured on this series. And, they do a good job, I think, of showing you how the fall from grace went, and Lando Norris's kind of off the cuff, her frank comments about it are right there, pretty clear. Like, the results just weren't there. And as much as we all love Ricciardo, it just didn't work out at McLaren, and he got replaced with a newcomer. And they don't actually tell you that he joins Red Bull as a third driver for next year. They kind of left that out, but they made it clear that Ricciardo's not racing next year. So overall, I thought 5 and 6 did a really good job of all the Alpine McLaren drama, which was so interesting for so long. So I was really happy about all that. Episode 7 is, I think, probably the most disappointing episode of the season. That's an episode about Checo Perez, leading up to his win at Monaco, and the pressure on him as the second driver at Red Bull, the second driver behind Max. We know the history of Red Bull's drivers behind Max. They don't last long, right? Checo has to perform and continue to perform to keep that seat. They set that up. Checo won twice last year, starting with Monaco. The thing is, though, I just think there was a huge element to this that they just completely ignored, right? They don't go into Brazil 2022. They acknowledge it in the final episode. That was George Russell's first win, the first Mercedes win of the season as well. Huge moment. I'm happy they at least included it briefly because that was, a significant event in the season. But they also don't factor in that Max refused to give Checo a place to help him fight for second place in the Drivers' Championship. Checo lost second place to Leclerc partially due to that. And they had a whole beef over Checo's Monaco qualifying crash that allegedly, Checo did on purpose to secure position. That needed to be on this series. That was a huge thing. That was in the open. And that's just completely ignored. I think that's a huge missed opportunity, but it's also natural, real drama that happened. And is right for the show. It's not manufactured. This is stuff that happened. This is stuff we talked about as it happened. I don't know why you have an episode about Checo and Red Bull, but you'd leave out something like that. Max dominated last year, won 15 races. They made this clear by the end of the series, end of the season. You should at least include like the one dramatic aspect about his season apart from the early DNFs. I don't know. It feels like a missed opportunity for what this show is trying to do. Episode 8, another Yuki Tsunoda episode after last season. In a sense, I get why they're following this up. I think they did a nice job, too, of setting up Pierre's leaving. Pressure's on Yuki to perform. Nick DeVries is coming in. Nick DeVries is going to want to be a killer. Someone who's going to be a rookie at 28, took forever to get into F1 despite being an F2 and F Formula E champion. DeVries is not Pierre. I like how they kind of juxtapose that. Whether that's like truly like DeVries' intention or not, I think that's like a great example of like making this good TV. I enjoyed that. Also, a nice way to show you at Austin when Stroll does that ridiculous weave into Alonso. I'm glad they left that in because man, that was an absurd fuck up from Lance Stroll. Yeah, so basically they're setting up 2023 the way it is for Yuki, which is a make or break season for him. We would not be shocked at all if Yuki gets dropped by AlphaTauri and Red Bull if he doesn't perform. Episode 9 goes into the cost cap stuff, I think pretty well. I would have liked them to explicitly say what the penalty was in terms of a fine and also the loss of wind tunnel time for Red Bull. And kind of hype that up for 2023 and beyond in terms of how that can impact their development. They just kind of left out that the result of the penalty perplexingly. I'm sure that'll be focused on next year at the start of next season. I get it, but still I would have liked them to say that. And episode 10, I thought was also pretty solid in terms of explaining Ferrari's strat and reliability problems that continued on and how Red Bull just was able to dominate. They basically allude to Bonato's axe, Fred Vasseur coming in. They tell you about George's first win. They kind of set up Ferrari versus Mercedes for second place, which wasn't really as dramatic as they let it out to be. But I understand there wasn't a whole lot of storylines at Abu Dhabi apart from that. And of course, McLaren and Alpine for P4. So I understand. Got the tease for Las Vegas for 2023, the return of Hulkenberg, without explicitly telling you that Mick was dropped. I wish they would just make it super clear for the average viewer. They briefly acknowledged Kevin Magnussen going on pole. Honestly, I feel like that should have been factored in somehow into the Mick episode 4. Like that was a obviously very lucky, fluky situation, but also an amazing moment for Magnussen and for Haas. Like you could use a few more minutes with that, I think. But yeah, in terms of stuff that was left out, I mentioned, of course, all the Checo Max drama at Brazil. Zhou's points on debut. I think one thing that would have been nice is like in terms of telling the story of how like the competition went, like when and they do. There's an awesome scene of the team principals talking with Dominicali and Toto blowing his top about how things are unsafe right now with the current situation. Horner telling him to fix his fucking car, et cetera, right? I wish they would have told you that what happened was that there was a regulation update for safety reasons. The floor had to be raised, the ride height had to be raised. And in the process, that hurt Ferrari's ability to run their car and didn't hurt Red Bull nearly as much. And as we knew watching the season, the second half, Red Bull had the race pace, Ferrari had the quality pace, Ferrari chewed their tires more. Like, I wish they could have like made that a little bit more clear about like what happened in the course of how these cars were going. The floor change hurting Ferrari more. I wish they could have known that just a second. I don't know. Also, in a sense, I get why they don't mention it, but technically George Russell beat Lewis last year on points. Technically he finished ahead, but they could have juxtaposed that with the fact that Lewis was doing more experimental setup work and like trying to fix stuff, and he, in all likelihood, would have beaten George had he been running the same kinds of setups. And of course, as we know, in the course of watching the race for the most part, even though George did get a win, Lewis didn't. Lewis had the edge in quality and generally in race pace. It would have been cool if they focused a little bit more on that. George is the first teammate to beat Lewis on points since Rosberg in 2016. It is significant, even if it's a bit fluky and we don't expect to see it in 2023. I don't know. You get so much Haas. I don't know. Maybe we could have seen the fact that they kept getting fucked with the black and orange flags. Certainly Gunther had something to say about that and cursed to the camera. I don't know. Also, like, they tell you, like, you show you Max dominating the last few episodes, kind of concluding the season with the series, but they didn't explicitly say that Max won from like 14th at Spa. Like, I think they should have like made that clear just how dominant his season was in the end. Um, I would have loved to see the drama of when Alonso and Hamilton had contact, and I forget what race it was, and then Alonso makes those comments about Lewis only winning in a good car, and then Lewis tweets the McLaren picture of him on the top podium and Alonso below him when they were teammates. Like, I love that shit. That's super dramatic. We know how Alonso is, and Lewis knows how to take it and send it back out when he needs to. That would have been fun just to include, but I guess there's not really a connective through line to include there, so I understand why it's not there. Overall, though, I think Drive to Survive season 5 did a really good job of showing you a lot of different storylines from the majority of the teams once again. Apologies to Aston, apologies to Alpha and Williams. We didn't really get much of them, but we got a decent amount of everybody else, and there was a lot to really get into with all those other teams. So I think it's a pretty effective season of this show. I'm looking forward to next season. And of course, I'm looking forward to the actual season of the sport, which I love. So if you're into the actual sport, of course, hit me up, tweet at me. I'll be online talking about it as the season goes in. Can't wait. And then I'll be reviewing Drive to Survive Season 6 when it comes out in a year. So for more F1 when it comes around, and for more TV reviews, subscribe. I'll see you next time.